Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
Taming the Wolf, Part 4 of the Wolfman Series. Well, the curated art installation at the Taming the Wild Art Gallery in Telluride, Colorado, it was a huge success. Couldn't have been more appropriate. Strange how Kat's life had always mirrored Jack's. Now, he was 5 years older than his sister, but they were as close as twins. Jack was struggling with his own version of the wild beast, and here Kat had curated an entire gallery showing of wolves. Jack chuckled at the irony as he walked through her grand opening display, looking at the paintings of the animal he feared he was becoming. 20 local artists displayed their work in this show, and several were Kat's own paintings. She walked up to him, 2 glasses of champagne in her hands, and handed one to her brother. "Now, I'm so glad you could attend. It means the world to me." And she reached up and gave her brother a kiss on the cheek. "You know I wouldn't miss it for the world," Jack replied. He asked her why'd she choose the wolf as the subject for her opening installment, and she just shrugged her shoulders. "You'd laugh at me if I told you, but I believe it's my spirit animal. I feel like I have a wolf watching over me, protecting me. I know that sounds funny to you," she grinned. He rolled his eyes as she would expect him to, but secretly he chuckled, again, at the irony. If only she knew how true that statement really was. Now, Jack was becoming a wolf. He could feel it in his muscles, in his blood. But he was a strong man of character, and he'd be damned if he'd let it get the best of him. Up to this point, he'd been able to control his wild impulses to hunt. He ran a cattle ranch in Montana. He had plenty of beef to eat. He controlled his appetite, and he kept his mind sound. Accepting the truth of what he was becoming played a big part in helping him keep control. That, and watching his friend Doc Morris succumb to the beast and take his own life because of it. Well, Jack had barely gotten through the details of dealing with his friend Doc's death, scheduling the cremation, putting his affairs in order, when he had to leave for Wyoming to attend the funeral of his other friend, Parker. Parker had died from the infection that coursed through his body after he was attacked. He hadn't been bitten, but the beast in his claws had nearly torn out his throat, and ultimately it had killed him. Now Jack was the only one left who had direct contact with the Jaggers. The other men who were in the original wolf hunting party, now they were lucky to have only witnessed the transformation. However, Jack knew that there could possibly be others out there. Others who had not been killed by Gunther, Hanna, or their son Hans, but merely wounded. If there were others, they'd have certainly transformed into werewolves. Of that he was certain. Now he was glad Kat was preoccupied with this new gallery. She'd stopped asking him about the events that led up to his injuries. It was best that way. He didn't want her to know. But now that he was planning a trip to Germany, he'd have to think of something to tell her. She'd want to know why he was going, and he'd have to give her a good reason. She'd be suspicious, that's for sure. He didn't like to lie to her, but just to come out and tell her he'd always wanted to visit there, or some other fool reason, he knew she wouldn't buy that for a second. Jack had not had a woman in his life for a long time. He'd been too busy. But Kat was always questioning him about dating and trying to set him up with her friends. Maybe he'd tell her he'd met someone in Germany. That was a stretch, but why else would he need to make a trip over there? He had no idea how long he'd be there. Maybe he'd tell her he was interested in raising some unique German livestock. Hell, he didn't know what to say. He was deep in thought when he spotted an unusual painting in the back of the gallery. It took his breath away. It was a painting of a creature, half man, half wolf, and it looked real enough to be a photograph. It was small, and he had to lean really close to read the inscription of the title and the artist on the small plaque underneath. Taming the Wolf was the title of the piece, painted by Catherine Moore. Jack's head started swimming. He felt dizzy, nauseated. How? And when? He jumped when he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Kat. I see you've met my spirit guide, she said. Back home in Kat's living room, they sat up, sharing a bottle of wine and talking. And Jack wanted to know all about that painting, and Kat was curious why Jack was so interested. Remember when I was a little girl and I had that really bad fever, Kat said. Mom and Dad took me to the doctor, and he said I had scarlet fever. I was so sick. Well, Jack did remember. He'd sat at her bedside for days, worried that he was losing his little sister. He remembered praying every night that his sister would get better. Well, Kat continued her story. I was having these crazy fever dreams, drifting in and out of consciousness. In my dreams, I saw this beast. It was half man and half wolf. In my dream, I was running, scared for my life. I didn't know what I was running from. Maybe I was running from death itself. But this wolf man stepped in, protected me from whatever it was that was trying to get me. He held me in his giant furry arms and told me he'd always be there for me. Oh, after I got well again, I remembered having that dream, and I've thought of it many times throughout my life. When I was trying to come up with an idea for my grand opening exhibit, in fact, it was just after seeing you after your injury, I remembered that dream again and decided that that would be the theme of my exhibit. Jack just stared at her in amazement. He figured now was as good a time as any to bring up the subject of his upcoming trip. I'm going to Germany, Kat. I'll be gone a while, maybe as much as a month. She didn't even question why he was going. Instead, she replied in an excited voice, Germany? Great. Can you do some research for me? I want to find out more about werewolves. I don't know if it's this exhibit or what, but I'm super intrigued by them. If you have the time, I'd love it if you'd do some background investigation for me. I'd like to plan a follow-up exhibit to this one. Well, Jack just grinned at the irony of it all. You bet, sis. He got up, kissed her on top of the head, and went off to bed. The direct flight from New York to Dusseldorf International Airport in the Rhine-Ruhr region was just over 10 hours. Jack had no clue where he was going, but Kat had given him a full itinerary and a guidebook of the area. She had done her research long before Jack had ever dreamed of making this trip. As he sat on the airplane, he read from the guidebook. Flipping through the pages, his eyes landed on a name that jumped off the page. It read, For many Germans, emigration to North America was an inviting alternative to the trials of life in the old country. From the mid-17th into the present century, thousands of Germans migrated across the Atlantic. They capitalized on the chance to escape poverty and persecution and to own their own land. After 1650, Germans settled throughout the states of Pennsylvania, Texas, New York, Illinois, and California. Many also landed in Canada, settling primarily in Ontario or farther west on the rich land of the prairies. Among them was Johannes Jaeger, who landed in Pennsylvania in the year 1743. Now here was another entry that caught his eye. Jaeger is mostly an American surname, a phonetic transcription of the common German surname Jaeger, meaning hunter. Huh, go figure, he chuckled to himself. Kat's obsession was beginning to make some sense, in a strange way. The half-man, half-wolf creatures she had seen in her dreams as a child had been what spurred her into attending art school in the Netherlands. She had spent time exploring the North Rhine, Westphalia region around the northern edge of the Rhenish Mountains in a little town called Bedburg. Kat had made arrangements for him to stay in a quaint inn in Bedburg, the site of the first known werewolf, Peter Stubbe. Peter was a confessed serial killer who was executed on October 31st, 1589, along with his daughter and his mistress. He was a German farmer who had been accused of being a werewolf, along with crimes of witchcraft and cannibalism. Peter Stubbe was born in the village of Epreth, near the town of Bedburg. He was a wealthy and well-respected farmer and a widower. Peter claimed that when he was 12 years old, the devil himself gave him the ability to transform into the likeness of a wolf, including the sharp teeth, a large body and paws, and he could transform himself at will. He confessed to killing goats, lambs, and sheep, as well as killing and eating 14 children, including his own son. But Stubby was suspected of many other murders. Now, the townspeople believed the wolf was stalking and attacking people and livestock in the area. One farmer caught the wolf in a trap, which cut off his right forepaw. The wolf escaped, and it proved without a doubt that Peter Stubby was indeed the wolf, as Peter was also missing his right hand. Then a few hunters decided to take their dogs and hunt the wolf. After days of hunting, they finally spotted it. The dogs chased and cornered the wolf, but when the hunters arrived, it was not an animal, but Peter Stubby. He was arrested there and confessed to his crimes, elicited by various means of torture. Now, his execution has been described as one of the most brutal on record, the likes of which are too gruesome to even repeat. Many werewolves from centuries ago were in fact serial killers, and France had its fair share. In the 15 and 1600s, there were several Frenchmen who allegedly swore allegiance to the devil and claimed to have an ointment that turned them into wolves. After confessing to brutally murdering and eating several children, they were burned to death at the stake. And burning was thought to be one of the few ways to kill a werewolf. Now, Jack couldn't believe he was actually reading this stuff. Superstitious nonsense he would have said only a few years ago. Now, here he was, traveling to Germany to seek out information on these creatures, of which he was now becoming one. He still couldn't believe this was all happening. Well, the inn at Bedburg was charming, and would have appealed far more to Kat than it did Jack. He was more comfortable in a cowboy bunkhouse than a cutesy bed and breakfast. Scones and tea? You gotta be kidding me. Give me coffee with a shot of bourbon, Jack laughed. The jolly rotund innkeeper thought he was just the cutest cowboy she'd ever seen, and told him he was the only man she'd ever known that actually wore a cowboy hat. She took to calling him Cowboy Jack and made him flapjacks and sausage for breakfast when all the other guests got muesli. Kat had given him a long list of places to go, things to see, information to gather, and people to contact. Why, she'd been planning on making that trip herself before she left the Netherlands, but her relationship with her boyfriend had ended badly, and she just wanted to go back home to the States and start her life over. The dream of opening her own art gallery and studio could now become a reality, and those plans became more of a priority than the trip to exploring Germany's werewolf legends. He wished she were here, though. She would have loved exploring this area, and it would have been a fun adventure for the both of them. But in the forefront of Jack's mind was his main goal of being here, to find someone who could help him find a cure or a way to counteract the curse that he had been given. The Jaggers had originally come from this part of Germany, and he hoped that he might find a clue as to why they left here to go to Montana and ultimately ruin his life. He planned to take the train to Cologne and the following day and see if there were any of Gunther and Hannah's relatives still living there. With nothing more to do that afternoon, he decided to take the famous hiking trail called the Werewolf Trail. It takes the hiker on a path of 7 stations, following the life and death of the historical werewolf Peter Stubby. Signboards described the history of the werewolf trials, similar to the witch trials. It sounded interesting, and a walk might just clear his head. The next morning he woke before his host could coerce him into another morning of flapjacks and sausages. She was already in the kitchen making coffee and was very disappointed that Jack would not be staying for breakfast. He was anxious to get on his way. Cologne was only a half an hour away by train. Finding the Jaeger family did not appear to be as easy as he thought. The German White Pages is available online in German only, and although he could type in Jaeger, he couldn't read the text that popped up with the address and the phone number. There were many, many entries, and he didn't know where to begin or what he'd say when he got on the phone. Ah, hello there. I'm wondering if any of your relatives are werewolves? He laughed at how ridiculous that sounded. He just wanted to go home. Maybe he could just live with this curse. Maybe if he ignored it, it would go away. The ever-present gnawing hunger for meat told him otherwise. Across the coffee shop from where he sat trying to make sense of the online phone book on his phone, he noticed a young woman staring at him from across the room. He smiled at her, and she picked up her cup of coffee and boldly came and sat at his table. "Are you from America?" she asked. "United States?" Jack replied that he was, and she gave him a great big smile. "Me too. I've been studying abroad for a year, and I'd like to stay longer. My visa is nearly expired, though, so I have to head home next week. My parents live in Nebraska, but my grandparents live here. My family's from this area. I'm German, but I really don't think of myself as German. I'll probably have to finish up school in Lincoln. Where do you live?" Jack chuckled. This girl had barely taken a breath in between all those words. "Well, I have a ranch in Montana. I'm just here on vacation." "Well, great. Let me show you around. I have nothing to do this afternoon. You're going to love the architecture around here, especially the castles. And I know the best deli in town. My grandparents own it. And there's lots of museums and, well, okay," Jack said hesitantly. He really wasn't looking for company, and he'd hoped to spend the day doing research. This almost felt like babysitting an overly talkative, extremely exuberant young cat when she was a freshman at college. "Oh, I guess I should ask your name," he laughed. "My name's Rebecca. Rebecca Jaeger. But all of my friends call me Beck." Jack just shook his head and smiled. "Okay, Beck, let's go meet your grandparents. I'd love to have a good deli sandwich." Jaeger's Deli was every bit as interesting as Beck made it out to be. It had been in the family for generations, in that same location. They made all their own sausages. They made sauerkraut and condiments. The potato salad was the best Jack had ever tasted. Now, the Jaegers, they were a friendly, happy people, much like their granddaughter. They didn't think it strange at all that a middle-aged cowboy from Montana was being led on a tour of the city by their Rebecca. They were just as welcoming. They asked Jack to come to their home later that evening for dinner. Well, the tour of the city was great. Jack took pictures for Kat. Mostly he was interested in getting back to the Jaegers for dinner. He wasn't sure how he was going to approach the subject of werewolves and their family history, but he knew that somehow he must. The Jaegers' home was a large timber-frame farmhouse in the old German style, where the living quarters and the barn are under one roof, and Jack found the architecture just fascinating. The bottom portion of the house was wide, with stalls on both sides built for animals. See, there was pens for cows, sheep, pigs, all adjacent to the main building. Now, Ludolf Jaeger explained that it had been called a Low German house, and it was traditional in this area since the 1500s. His home had been built in 1680, and had always been in his family. Originally, the family lived with the animals, but in the early 1800s, the family home was built upstairs. Well, Gertrude called them in for dinner and put a spread that could have fed a family of 12. There were sausages and ham, followed by a pot roast stew and a beef roll. Rebecca delighted in telling him the German names for each one of the dishes. The Jaegers apparently had as strong a desire for meat as Jack did. Beck did not stop talking throughout the entire meal, and the Jaegers carried the conversation almost as much as she did. Jack didn't stand a chance against this bunch. He tried occasionally to lead the conversation toward their family history. He couldn't get a word in. After dinner, Gertrude poured each of them a glass of Jägermeister. Ludolf explained that it was a traditional drink in Germany, and the name literally meant master of the hunt. Finally getting a chance, Jack asked about the family name of Jaeger. He explained that he had known a family by that name back in Montana. Gertrude let out a small gasp, and Ludolf said, "I wondered if that was why you were here." He took a deep breath and asked Rebecca to go feed the animals and let them talk in private. And then he began his story. The Jaegers come from a long line of wolf hunters. My name, Ludolf Jaeger, literally translates to wolf hunter. In the early 1700s, our ancestor, Jacob Jaeger, had two sons, Johannes and Stefan. The two boys were bitter enemies. Jacob would pit the two boys against each other and told them that the strongest of the two would inherit this farm. The weaker of the two would have to leave to find a life of his own away from here. Now Stefan was older and stronger, but Johannes was crafty. They say he made a pact with the devil, who gave him the ability to turn into a wolf. Stefan and his brother took turns watching the sheep that were out to summer pasture. At night they were rounded into a sheep pen, and whichever brother was in charge would sleep outdoors with the flock. Johannes planned to sneak into the sheep pen at night, pretending to be after the sheep, knowing that his brother would be there. His plan was to attack and kill his brother. Instead, Johannes went to the sheep pen that night as a wolf, but his brother was not there. Filled with an irresistible urge to eat meat, he killed a sheep and ate it. The next night, he did the same thing. Still his brother was not there. He killed another sheep and again ate that one. The third night, Jacob was very angry that his sheep were being attacked and blamed his two sons for not keeping an eye on them. He didn't know Stefan was actually down at the neighboring farm sleeping with the farmer's daughter, and Johannes was out hunting for prey in the woods. He went to the sheep pen, and not finding either boy there, he was ready to shoot whatever predator was attacking the sheep, and possibly his own two boys as well. So Johannes shows up in full wolf form, and the father shoots him in his right foreleg, and again in the butt. The wolf ran off howling and limping, and the next day he's home with pellets in his right arm and his butt. Now, during that time, the werewolf trials were in full swing, much like the witchcraft trials. The townspeople showed no mercy if they thought you were guilty. Rather than be burned at the stake, Johannes fled to the coast, where he boarded a ship and sailed to the United States. Stefan inherited the farm. The curse that Johannes brought to his family had lived on every generation since, and we have hunted our family members for generations. We are the wolf hunters, but we have family who are werewolves. Now let me ask you, Jack, how well did you know Gunther and Hannah Jaeger? Jack proceeded to tell them about what had occurred in Montana, and that they had a son, Hans, who had also been killed. He did not tell them that he had been bitten and was carrying the curse himself. He still wasn't comfortable letting anyone know that detail, but he had an idea that Ludolf was already suspicious. It was getting late. Ludolf thanked Jack for letting him know about their relatives back in the States and shook his hand. He went to his desk and wrote a name down on a piece of paper and handed it to Jack. "Give this man a call. He might be able to help you." No more words were spoken, but there was a look in his eyes that told Jack that Ludolf knew the truth. Well, Jack had missed the late train for Bedburg, so Beck dropped him off at a hotel in downtown Cologne. Sitting in his room, he thought about the events of the day. How coincidental it was he had picked the one coffee shop in town where he would meet Beck, a distant cousin of Hans, and then to meet her grandparents. And the paper with a handwritten name inscribed. Was it divine providence? Did he have an angel looking out for him? Was he just damn lucky? For a man that didn't believe in anything supernatural, all of this was pretty hard to swallow. At first light, he was awake, anxious to make contact with the name Ludolf had given him. He'd had a bad night of dreams. They were getting vivid and all the more real. He dreamt he was running through a dark forest, his ears picking up the sounds of every creature moving in the underbrush. Little field mice scampered underneath. Frogs were croaking, and the night birds calling out, but he was looking for bigger prey. He saw a woman jogging, earbuds in her ear. Of course it didn't make sense. A woman jogging alone in the night on a dark wooded trail. But the feeling he had was beyond the desire for the taste of her blood. He sprung upon her and ripped her throat open so she couldn't scream. He tore into her body with his long fangs. He lifted his head and let out a mighty howl, blood dripping from his mouth. He woke, drenched in sweat, and ran to the bathroom and threw up. At 8 a.m. he made the call. Professor Luther picked it up on the first ring. "I was expecting your call. Ludolf phoned me earlier. Can you meet for coffee?" Professor Luther was an authority on werewolves. He had published several books on the subject and taught a class at the local university on werewolf lore. He was very excited to meet Jack. Apparently, Ludolf had told him Jack had the curse. He was astounded that Jack had been able to hold back the transformation as long as he had. He explained that most people, men, women, and children, are unable to resist the curse after being bitten. Most have gone through the transformation within a day or two after the initial bite. He explained what happens to the body on a cellular level, how the DNA of the wolf merges with the RNA of a human and changes it. Most people see actual physical signs of the transformation soon after being bitten. Things like abnormal hair growth, elongated fingernails, bone spurs at the top of their feet and hands, the tops of ears becoming more pointed and often with hair sprouting from the ridge. The head itself becomes larger, the forehead more pronounced, and the jawline starts to bud out. The change in the teeth is perceptible as well, with the canine incisors getting longer and sharper, like fangs. He explained that some people experience a complete transformation into a full body form of a wolf, while others have partial transformation, usually just their upper torso and their head. While their lower torso, their hips and their legs, they still appear human. And still there are others who transform mentally into killers, but show very little outside physical transformation. Hitler, for example, Charles Manson, among others. Children who have been bitten often turn into serial killers. Some may even take the lives of their own families or friends or schoolmates. It is not something they can outgrow. And it is very interesting that it tends to run through generations of the same family, as if the RNA and the DNA leaves a trace in the unborn fetus. For example, a father or a mother who has the curse may have several children, but only one of them might have that trace protein. The RNA carries genetic information that is necessary for their cellular transformation, and it is random. The idea that a werewolf only transforms during a full moon that's really just a myth, he explained, brought on most likely due to the fact that animals are out during the full moon. There's more to prey upon. Wolves like to hunt at night, but there is more to it than that. Our bodies are mostly comprised of water, and studies have shown that there is a slight change to our body's chemistry during the moon's phases. The chemistry of the werewolf's blood grows stronger during the full moon. Have you noticed that you crave more meat during the days when the full moon is present? Jack had to think about that. The hunger for red meat was a constant daily craving. Was it stronger during the full moon? He really wasn't sure. Well, Professor Luther had spent his adult life studying the biochemistry of the blood of the infected. As a young man, he had encountered his first werewolf, his roommate and best friend at college. He noticed that the young guy would often leave his dorm room late at night, coming home with bloody clothes. He would shower, throw his clothes in the trash, and sleep through the entire next day. He also knew that several young women on campus had gone missing, and he feared that his friend was the killer. He considered reporting him to the authorities, but confronted him instead. Remorsefully, his friend told him the truth of the curse he had lived with since he was a child and had been bitten by a rabid dog. Luther took blood samples from his friend, hoping to analyze them and find a cure for his friend's affliction. Within days of confessing to his friend, he was shot and killed while in wolf form, stalking the campus. That was in 1960 and was the beginning of Professor Luther's obsession with the werewolf. The professor paused and stared into Jack's eyes. "I do believe," he said, "that I might have something that will help you. If you're willing to let me experiment on you, I may be able to cure you." He motioned for the bill, and Jack reached for his wallet to pay. The professor asked Jack to follow him to a German apothecary. There he purchased a very small bag of an herb called wolfsbane and a jar of raw, unprocessed honey. The professor explained that wolfsbane is also known as an aconite and comes with the monk's hood flower. It's highly toxic and can cause a slowing of the heart rate, which can be fatal even in very small amounts. Its poison can also act through contact with the skin, particularly through open wounds. There's no known antidote. It is known as the queen of poisons, and just 5 milligrams, the weight of a sesame seed, can kill an adult. The professor explained that when mixed into a tincture and with the blood from a werewolf and taken once a day in the week prior to the full moon, it will kill the wolf, but not the man. It's your only hope, the professor said as he shook Jack's hand. Come back to see me 1 week before the full moon. I'll mix the tincture concoction for you. He handed the jar of honey to Jack. Meanwhile, I want you to eat a large spoonful of this honey every night before you go to bed. Do not use a silver spoon. Metal changes the enzymes in honey and renders it practically useless. Use a wooden spoon or plastic if you must. The enzymes in the honey will help you sleep and eliminate your nightmares. Jack thanked the professor and walked to the train station and returned to Bedburg. It was already late in the afternoon. He'd spent the entire day with Luther and he'd learned so much. A lot of the information he could share with Kat, and he was anxious to call her. He looked at his watch. Well, Germany was about 8 hours ahead of her in Colorado. He decided he'd wait till he got back to the inn to call her. During the short train ride to Bedburg, Jack thought about his day with the professor. Luther had seemed so academic about it all, but to Jack, it was very real. He could feel it growing stronger in him every day. He felt challenged by it, but fearful at the same time. He hoped his strength and character was strong enough to hold it at bay. He was aware that at any moment the wild, cannibalistic urge of the wolf might overpower him. Once widespread in Central Europe, wolves had almost been hunted to extinction by the 19th century, regarded as a danger to livestock, competitors for game, and a threat to people. But 20 or so years ago, these predators started to come back. Not through reintroduction, but by naturally migrating west from Poland. In the years since, they have managed to not only reestablish themselves in Germany, but to steadily strengthen their hold, increasing their population by 25% annually. Wolves can travel great distances to find new territories. Under German law, wolves are protected, just like many parts of the United States. In Montana, it was still legal to shoot a wolf, only if it was actively harassing your cattle and you could prove it. He thought about his buddy Don in Colorado. Don had a ranch in North Park, and he woke up one morning to find one of his cows being torn apart by a wolf, the third recent attack. If he were in Montana, Wyoming, or Idaho, he could have pulled out his gun and shot the predator, but not in Colorado. Wolves are protected under state law, and killing them, no matter how many cows or sheep or pet dogs they attack, is not allowed and carries a penalty up to a $100,000 fine, a year in jail, and a lifetime loss of hunting privileges. In the span of a month, a wolf pack that roamed into northern Colorado from Wyoming had killed 2 cows and 1 border collie, badly injured 2 other cows that had to be euthanized. The Colorado Parks and Wildlife authorized an emergency resolution allowing ranchers to haze wolves by chasing them in a vehicle, firing rubber bullets at them, hiring range riders to watch the herd overnight, at their own expense, of course, or scaring them with flags hung along fence lines. Unbelievable. It wasn't just wolves that he had to contend with back home at his ranch. There were grizzlies and mountain lions after his cattle, too. His mind wandered. Why the wolf? What was the connection between wolves and people that allowed this kind of transformation to take place? Why not some other animal, like a bunny? Jack chuckled to himself. A large part of him still couldn't believe any of this was happening. He got back to the inn and retired to his room to give Kat a call. She was anxious to hear from him, and he carefully told her about his day with the Jaggers and the professor. She still didn't know why he had wanted to make the trip to Germany in the first place, and she didn't ask. She was thrilled that he was finding so much information for her. She was already planning her art installation around the subject and gave him a few more specific places to visit and a photograph for her. Well, Jack made a joke about being her research assistant. but secretly he was glad for the task she'd given him. He had 2 weeks to wait before he could meet with the professor for his cure, and he didn't know what he was going to fill those 2 weeks up with. About 70 miles from Bedburg, there was a village called Wittlich, where they say the last werewolf in Germany was killed. Why they think it was the last werewolf is hard to say. A deserter from Napoleon's army was fleeing to his homeland. While passing by the village of Wittlich, he spotted a farmhouse and decided to raid it for food. The farmer and his 2 sons returned home, found him stealing their food, and confronted him. They were killed. The farmer's wife, in her grief, called out a curse to the man, calling him a rabid wolf. He killed her too, but her curse worked. The man fled to the forest. Days later, a group of villagers found him by his campfire in the woods. They gave chase and cornered him near the village of Moorbach, and they killed him. They buried him at a crossing. There a shrine was erected, where a candle burns continually. As long as the candle is lit, so the legend goes, the werewolf will not return. Now, in 1988, a group of Air Force personnel were returning to their base at Moorbach and noticed the candle had blown out. They joked about it since everyone in the vicinity knows of the legend. Later, at the base, the automatic sirens went off. Someone or something had activated the perimeter fence sensors. While investigating, a security guard spotted a large creature that looked like a wolf standing on its hind legs. It gazed at the soldier, then jumped the 3-meter fence with ease and ran off into the woods. A police dog was brought in to track the beast, but upon arriving at the spot where the werewolf was seen, the dog began trembling and howling, refusing to go any further. Was it really a werewolf or a joke to scare the new recruits? It's hard to say, but the candle was relit, and to this day the creature has not been seen again. Jack took photos of the shrine and was sitting at a small outdoor table at a cafe nearby. He was about to send the photos to Kat when he heard squealing tires and saw a large truck careening toward him. The crash that ensued sent patrons jumping out of the way, knocking over tables and chairs in their haste. Jack barely missed being hit by the truck as it slammed into a parked vehicle and flipped over onto the sidewalk right where Jack was sitting. There were several screams mixed with the sounds of broken glass and cars honking. The truck had plowed right through a red light and into oncoming traffic before hitting the parked car and landing upside down on the sidewalk cafe. In the commotion and confusion that followed, Jack got a heady whiff of blood. He breathed it in and felt that urge that was so familiar from his dreams. He walked over to the cab of the truck and saw a man, pinned between his steering wheel and the bent door frame, a large gash across his temple. Jack felt himself swoon, dizzy and salivating. He knew he should try to help, but he couldn't shake the dizziness. He stepped away, stumbling, almost falling over a chair in his haste to get away from that overpowering, mouth-watering smell of blood. He fought back the urge to reach inside that cab, tear the man's throat, sink his teeth into his flesh. He forced himself to back away, breathing heavily. People were running now, checking vehicles for other injuries. He could hear someone asking him if he was okay. He looked up and felt his nostrils flare, his lips curl back into a snarl. A person retreated, their eyes large as they looked him in the face. It was all he could do to keep from grabbing them. He turned and he ran, letting his feet carry him away from the carnage. He had fought the beast inside himself, and he had won, this time. But it was the hardest thing he ever had to do. He hunched into a fast walk all the way back to the train station. Tried not to make eye contact with anyone along the way. He couldn't remember if he'd even paid for his food. He didn't think so. Probably no one would notice anyway, not in all that commotion. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to arch his neck and howl. He was shaking the entire train ride back to Bedburg. He tried not to think of that smell of blood. The sight of the gash on that man's head, it was just too much. Maybe if he could just kill a cat, a dog, something, it would alleviate this torture he was feeling inside. But he knew if he did, there would be no going back. No, he wasn't going to let this beast take hold of him. He could fight it, or he'd die trying. Back in Bedburg, he rushed to the inn, ran inside and locked himself in his room. He didn't care what else Kat wanted him to do. He needed to stay locked away. He couldn't risk being around people right now. He'd tell the innkeeper he was sick, that he needed to be left alone. She could leave his food outside at the door. It would be a long 2 weeks before he could meet with Professor Luther and get his cure. He knew the innkeeper had been in his room earlier. She'd straightened up his room and gave him fresh linens. There was nothing unusual about that. But on the bedside table, he saw an oversized envelope that he hadn't noticed before. He walked over and he picked it up. It was sealed. He sliced his finger as he slid open the flap, and without thoughts, stuck his finger up to his lips and tasted the blood. Immediately revolting at the taste, feeling the hunger well up inside himself again. Not for his own blood, but any taste of blood was good. He reached inside the envelope and pulled out a stack of photographs. They were old black and whites, obviously taken a great many years ago. Perhaps the early 1900s from the looks of the clothing. He flipped through them, wondered who left them and why, when suddenly he let out a gasp. The photograph he held in his hand was a picture of a half-man, half-beast kneeling on the ground next to a young woman. The beast was looking up into the camera just as the picture had been taken. He had blood on his face and down his neck. Jack looked closely at the photo, studying the beast. The woman's face was hidden, but you could see that her clothes were ripped and soaked with blood. He turned to the next photo and felt his knees collapse. The beast had arched his neck and head into the arc of a howl, and the angle was such that he could now make out the face of the woman in the photograph. It looked exactly like Kat.